Criminals, terrorists, even rioters. One of our guests says they've all found a handy shield from justice in the Human Rights Act. Should we get rid of it? Good morning, welcome to Sunday Morning Live. The Human Rights Act is meant to protect the vulnerable from torture, oppression and injustice. But John Bird from The Big Issue knows a thing or two about the vulnerable and reckons we don't need it.
The 1998 European Human Rights Act has greatly distorted justice in Britain and has got to go.
My other guests this week have all had brushes with the law. John Bird spent his early years in and out of prison before founding The Big Issue. And he's fronted a reality TV show. As a feminist writer, Julie Bindels battled for women's rights in the courts for decades. John Gaunt's opinions may have blistered your radio ears over the years, but he wasn't slow to use the Human Rights Act when he lost his job. We'll hear if he's still so keen on it. And we want to hear what you think this morning. Call in now to challenge our guests on Skype. You can give your views on Twitter or by phone. Phone calls cost up to 5p a minute from a BT landline. Calls from mobiles and other networks may cost considerably more. Texts will be charged at your standard message rate. Now, the Human Rights Act enshrines our right to education, free elections, free speech and a family life. Rights we'd all stand up for. But John Bird says the Act also protects criminals ahead of the innocent and should go. This is his Sunday Stand.
The 1998 European Human Rights Act has greatly distorted justice in Britain and has got to go. 2 weeks ago, the streets of Tottenham in North London erupted when a peaceful demonstration turned to criminal disorder. The police held back. Why? Largely because they were frightened of being seen as heavy-handed. Every kind of life-threatening civil disorder cannot be faced with our protectors tied down, worried about over-exaggerated human rights issues. Is it right to value the human rights of a violent mugger over a victim? Or let a prisoner wave the human rights flag so they don't have to go to court? No, the system is flawed. One person's human rights are maintained at the expense of another's. The perpetrator has better guarantees than those seeking justice. Therefore, justice is often there only for the wrongdoer and not for the victim. We cannot allow this gross distortion of justice to continue for another day. We need justice, and we need it now, for the victims as much as the perpetrators.
Julie, is John right?
No. The reason why we need a Human Rights Act is so that the individual is protected against the state when the state misbehaves. Now, I can see why many people will think that this is an act only used by criminals. It's not. Cameron, his knee-jerk reaction to this is because Cameron is actually pandering to Daily Mail readers. The reason why most of the general public think that the Human Rights Act is a charter for rapists and murderers and all sorts of criminals such as the rioters is because the Daily Mail and other tabloids run stories that disproportionately reflect those the ways in which that can be used. Now, if you think about prison law, many people in prison need to use this act. Whether or not they've committed a crime, they have the right to do so. So no, John isn't right.
And I can see John wants to get back in on that and John Gaunt wants to get in as well. But before they do, here's the question for our text vote this morning. Should we get rid of the Human Rights Act? If you think we should, text the word vote followed by yes. If you disagree, text vote followed by no. Our text number is 81771 and texts will be charged at your standard message rate. For full terms and conditions, visit bbc.co.uk/Sunday Morning Live and we'll show you how you voted at the end of the programme. John Gaunt, you've used it.
I am using it. Article 10. I mean, I think most people...
Article 10 being?
Of the Human Rights Act. I mean, the bottom line of the Human Rights Act, it does get bad press, as Julie says, but it always gets mixed up with our involvement with the EU. The two are separate, but they're also intrinsically linked. What's wrong is that we need British courts and British justice. Most people in this country want our sovereignty to come back to our country.
Okay, but if we untangle it from the EU, because as you said, it seems to be linked to the EU in some people's minds, but it's entirely separate.
Well, it isn't really, because it is linked, because you can't be a member of the EU and not be signed up to the Charter. But the bottom line is this: what people want in this country is British laws for British people.
Okay, but the Human Rights Act passed by a British Parliament, introduced by a British Parliament.
Introduced by Tony Blair, of course.
Most of the lawyers who wrote it were British lawyers.
Yeah, but the bottom line is here, we haven't even had a referendum on whether we want to be in the EU. People do feel remote. They feel that our law is being dictated from outside. So what needs to happen, Mr Cameron's right, we do need a British Bill of Rights, our own Human Rights Act. Then we'd have more control over it. But we can't have that whilst we remain in the EU, which is why we should have a referendum on the EU, and then we should reframe it and have it in this country. Because the basic tenets of the Human Rights Act, as you said, Susanna, let me just get this point over, are right. Freedom of expression. I had to use Article 10. It was the only thing open to me because I believe my rights to free speech had been infringed. And I'm still using it now. You have to use whatever law is available to you.
Do you not see a contradiction in opposing it but using it?
No, because we live in a democracy, and as you rightly said, an elected government put us into this Human Rights Act, so you use the law that's available to you. You don't have to agree with it.
Yeah, of course, John Bird.
Let me have a word. It's my programme. But you look at it this way. I mean, I don't care what anybody says. I was in the prison system.
Yeah.
And over the period of time, they've lost the plot over the perpetrator. They've lost the plot over the wrongdoer. So they tell everybody they're a victim of psychological, sociological stuff. And they've absolutely turned a whole group of people into very astute people who know. So my nephew-in-law, who's a copper out on the streets, he tells me when he stops kids who've got drugs on them, who've got money on them and all sorts of things, they all know their human rights. They all know that, in fact, you can't do this and you can't do that.
John,
and I can tell you, sorry, I'm gonna make this point, because I tell you that it doesn't matter what law you've got, it's the spirit of the law.
Okay, so it's changed the culture and it's changed the spirit.
And the interpretation of the human rights over the last 10 years
John, you've spoken enough.
Has changed.
Well, let Julie come back in because she wants to take issue with it.
What we need to remember is that it is a criminal offence for a copper to clip some young hooligan round the ear. It is a criminal offence for a teacher to hit a student, a pupil. So we already have enshrined in our domestic law this. Now, if these kids are coming out with human rights language, it's only because they've heard it on TV, read it in the paper. It actually is no different to the law that we already have. What's important about human rights legislation is that any individual can use it, whether or not you're a perpetrator of a crime or a victim. For example, Catherine Zeta-Jones and Michael Douglas used it against the photographs that were taken against their will. Same as you.
But the bottom line is, Julie, because
prisoners alone.
But because it's in Europe, it seems to be too remote from us. Whereas if it was our own Bill of Rights, we'd be in control of it.
But we don't need to go to Strasbourg anymore.
Hang on, in this country, John's right, too many people know their rights and not enough people know their responsibilities. We need to take control of our agenda.
I'm walking along, I meet a guy who will never work again because he has been mugged by somebody.
Yeah.
And when he goes to court, there's a guy who will never earn a cross of living, a man in his early 50s. And when he goes to court, the thing that really appalls him is that they go on about how they can't offend the human rights of the person who perpetrated this crime.
I'd like to bring in a human rights lawyer on this, because let's put that to somebody who actually deals with this in practice. Mohsin Aslam is a human rights lawyer. You've heard these stories, Mohsin. Prisoners who claim it's a breach of their rights to leave their cell to come to court. A burglar let out early because it breached his right to family life, not to spend time with his children. The argument being, we prioritise the rights of the individuals and it seems an injustice to the rest of society.
Well, let's not forget that these are tabloid stories. I mean, a lot of these cases aren't even brought to court. But I think that it's a complete nonsense to suggest that we should scrap the Human Rights Act. It would be to this country's shame if we lost this clear and basic statement of our citizens' human rights on the basis of a flawed analysis and misunderstanding of its relevance to our society. And by the way, senior judges in this country and even the Director of Public Prosecutions agree that the Human Rights Act has been a very good thing for this country. And it seems to me that it's only some conservative politicians that want to scrap it. In the real world, a place where politicians often seem to find hard to locate, there is no requirement for a legally binding code of responsibility. There is only one responsibility, which is to obey the law. Every law in the statute without our responsibility. We have so many laws.
Okay.
9 years was legislative hyperactivity. I don't think we need more.
Okay, Adam Wagner is from UK Human Rights blog. Adam, John's point is that there seems to be something un-British about the Human Rights Act, and it should be replaced by something more British. What do you make of that argument? You must have heard that before.
Well, it's saying it's non-British is just to ignore the history of it. The history of the Human Rights Act, which is founded on the European Convention on Human Rights, is that the convention was drafted mostly by British lawyers, mainly by a British Conservative lawyer, and it was implemented by our own Parliament. It's also based more fundamentally on rights, which go back to our own Bill of Rights, which already exists in 1689. So really, to say it's anti-British is really taking a sort of we don't like Europe line and not really thinking about it properly.
John, go on.
Absolute rubbish. What I'm saying is that if you want to get it more accepted to the British public, if it was a British Human Rights Act and it was actually all the judgments were by British judges, it'd be fine. It's things like what gets on people's goat is when the Human Rights Act is being now used so that prisoners can have votes, when the overwhelming majority of people in this country, poll after poll after poll, do not want that to happen.
Well, Adam,
that's why it gets a bad rap.
That issue, the right of prisoners to have a vote, has even been voted on in the UK Parliament.
We don't want it.
The Prime Minister says it makes him feel sick, but apparently, according to the Human Rights Act, it has to be allowed. Now, can you see the tension there?
There's definitely a tension, which is exactly the point of the Human Rights Act. The point of the Human Rights Act is that everybody has rights. Those rights are meant to be enforced in a non-political, non-emotional way. Prisoners are a good example of people that, because politicians don't have to rely on their votes, they don't have to think about them, they don't have to enforce their rights.
Exactly.
So
can I remind everybody that women
not...
didn't actually have the right to vote not that long ago.
There's a massive difference between prisoners and women, Julie.
John, you've been a prisoner. Wouldn't you have liked to have had the right to vote when you were in prison?
I think if you don't take our children when they go into prison and you don't reform them, then that is against human rights, because I think we have a responsibility to reform our children. I don't care about the judges. I don't care about these people. I don't care about the middle classes talking to the underclass where most of the crime takes place, and start telling them that actually this is good for them and not. What we need to do is we need to reform people who get involved in crime, and you can't do that when you're straddled with all these human rights. And as I said in my film, I think if the human rights was as good for the victim as it was for the perpetrator, and I don't read the tabloids.
Victims of crime use the Human Rights Act
on a
regular basis.
I am not a right-wing
Rape victims use the Human Rights Act.
Well, listen but John, listen to Julie.
Lots of victims of crime.
Julie is talking about victims who use the Human Rights Act. Lots of victims of crime.
And actually, what I'd like to say now to any lawyers, any human rights lawyers watching this programme, is start actually being braver and start using this act for the victims of crime, particularly women and children who've suffered sexual violence, because they really can apply the law in an appropriate way. And all we hear about, because actually the Act has been used disproportionately for those accused of crimes. But remember, anyone can be falsely accused of a crime and end up in prison, end up in a police cell, end up dying in a police cell, which is partly what is so important about this law. So remember, lawyers, start using it bravely for the victims of sexual violence.
Well,
then we won't hear so many Daily Mail stories about
John,
it.
you said you don't care about the criminals and you don't care about the lawyers.
I'm saying I don't care about the judges.
Yeah, OK, well, let's talk to someone who you may care about, Debbie Purdy. Debbie Purdy has multiple sclerosis and joins us on the phone this morning. Debbie, you wanted to know if your husband would be prosecuted if you chose to commit suicide at some stage and he helped you. How did you use the Human Rights Act?
We went to court to ask that that I have a right to understand the law and that my right to understand what would happen to the people I love if I committed suicide. The thing is that the human rights law can be misused, it can be abused, it can be very one-sidedly used, but without it we would be much poorer nation, and I wouldn't be alive today, and I love my life, if the human rights legislation, which our politicians are too scared of the electorate to deal with, if they had not said that I had a right to know what would happen in certain situations. And I think that we've got to be very careful about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Debbie, why do you say that you wouldn't be alive today without it?
To die.
I was in the middle, because I didn't believe we would win at court, and I was losing the ability to control my hands myself. I was, my MS was developing, and that meant that I would lose the ability to commit suicide myself and therefore have to ask somebody to help me. That meant that they would face the possibility of prosecution, and I needed to know what the situation was. I was halfway through arranging to go to Switzerland because I didn't know whether or not my husband would be prosecuted.
OK, Debbie, thank you so much. John?
Sorry, I didn't get much of that argument. Can I just return to what I think is really important?
She managed, under the Human Rights Act, she managed to achieve clarity because of her right to a private and family life, and it was agreed that she needed to have that clarity about what would happen if eventually her husband went with her to commit suicide.
I would never dispute that the Human Rights Act, like everything, has a good side and a bad side. What I would dispute is the fact that if you actually talk to people in the street, and not all of them are tabloid readers, and I'm not a tabloid reader, I never read anything like that, that there is a loss of a sense of justice because most crime is poor on poor. So what you got is you got poor on poor.
That's not true.
That is
John,
actually,
that's not true.
That's true. That's true.
Sexual crime, domestic violence, child abuse,
poor on poor,
corporate crime.
Can I finish the point? Can I finish the point?
Okay.
It's poor on poor crime, and what actually happens is that the perpetrator gets away with that, and the victim gets left behind. And I can give you countless occasions over the last 10 years that I've met people who have suffered because of the way in which the courts have emphasised the human rights of the perpetrator and not of the person. And that's all I'm saying. I'm saying, and it's not a right-wing, it's not a left-wing argument. It's about getting justice back to victims.
I've met countless people who have been badly served by the courts, who've been badly served by the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, the judiciary, the magistracy, jurors. That has nothing to do with the Human Rights Act. It's to do with a legal system not being perfect. And that's why I'm a feminist law campaigner, because you have to reform the law, you have to push at its boundaries to make it better. And I agree that many victims of crime have been badly served by this law. Many victims have been well served by it.
But the human rights lawyer, as per usual, wanted to depict it as if it was tabloid newspapers and a few right-wingers who want this, when actually, when we come to, like, for example, prisoners' votes, the overwhelming overwhelming majority of people in this country do not want prisoners to have votes. Our own Parliament doesn't want to have it, but because we're part of the Human Rights Act and because we're part of the EU, they can impose that on us. That cannot be right. That's why we want a referendum on the EU. That's why then Mr Cameron could have his own Bill of Rights. We could still have a Human Rights Act, but it could be ours. And it could be looking at our particular circumstances. This is a great country.
But, John, we're never going to get a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights would, I mean, as you pointed out earlier, we'd have to withdraw from the EU.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
Why can't we do that?
Cameron is a knee-jerk responder
John,
to this.
I want to ask, which of the rights in the Human Rights Act would you not like? Is it prohibition of torture? Is it the right to liberty, right to a fair trial?
It's the spirit. You've missed my point.
But Julie's argued that is about how our courts interpret it and about justice generally. Isn't this just about
most of the stuff
interpreting
in the Human Rights Act most people would agree with. It actually goes back to our Magna Carta, the idea of a judiciary and the idea of a jury and the idea of freedom of expression, right? Those things are right. Where people get angry is the fact that when our Parliament decide on certain things, for example, prisoner votes, we can be overruled by this European Court.
Let's introduce a couple
That's what we need to address.
And we're going to put it to a text poll in just a moment.
Stopping torture, for goodness sake.
Well, it's part of the Human Rights Act.
No, but it doesn't mean you can't say it shouldn't be framed. That's wrong. It's a misinterpretation of what I'm saying.
Shall I put some of these viewers' texts and emails to you? Sue says, when we did get a slap from a teacher at school or from the local copper on the beat, we didn't misbehave again.
Absolutely.
We also learnt respect. Don't we need that again? Somebody who describes himself as a beaten wife has got in touch from Middlewich. The police have failed to deliver me from intimidation, quoting my husband's human rights, despite a restraining order. This must stop. And Gwyn says it seems a criminal element know their human rights but forget the human wrongdoing. The Human Rights Act allows criminals an escape clause for all their wrongdoing. After all, if you are a good citizen, you don't require any assistance to escape prosecution or deportation. Just a quick comment, Julie.
The problem is many police officers don't actually understand the law, and they don't know whether it's domestic law or human rights law. And with all due respect to the police, you know, if you send out a junior copper to a domestic violence incident and some of them still don't take it seriously, they may well use that human rights language. What they mean is that actually it's the domestic law of this country which means that there are certain circumstances in which they cannot arrest and prosecute.
Okay,
and I
well,
think
that is our
Julie made a
textbook.
good point earlier when she said about lawyers. They tend to go for these kind of cases, like that idiot who's trying to get prisoners' votes. That man went down for manslaughter. He butchered his landlady. That's the chap who now wants votes for prisoners. That's when it gets sticks in people's gullets.
And the lawyer who's trying to get Peter Sutcliffe out of prison.
Precisely.
I absolutely agree, but that is not a fault of the human rights law. It's a fault in the application of it, and it's a fault of those
we could clearly devote a whole programme to discussing the Human Rights Act, but we have other things to discuss.
The rights of our Parliament must come above Europe each and every time.
That's our text poll today. Do you agree with the two Johns? We should get rid of the Human Rights Act. If you agree, then text the word vote followed by yes. If you disagree, text vote followed by no. Our text number is 81771. Text will be charged at your standard message rate. You have around 20 minutes before the poll closes. Well, we have to discuss that because we have a reality to get to ourselves. The result of the text poll vote is in. We asked, should we get rid of the Human Rights Act? And here's what you told us. 11% of those of you who texted in said, yes, we should get rid of it, which means, John and John, 89% say no, we should not, we should keep it.
Well, that's up to them. You know, as I said, I don't come from this from a right-wing angle. All I come at it as a person who was commissioned to work with the poor. And I work with the poor, and I see the poor suffering because they don't get justice. And I really don't care about judges. I don't think judges know an awful lot about justice. They might know about law, about justice. And it's about the spirit of the law.
I do apologise. Now, this, I'm afraid, is an embarrassment. But we, unfortunately, because of a technical hitch, it's going to completely undermine what you just said. The poll result was the wrong way round. 89% of those who voted said yes, we should get rid of the Human Rights Act. 11% said no, we should not. I was right. You see, you did win that particular argument.
I was lost for words for once.
I have to leave the programme there.
I didn't know what to say.
We will see you
did that on purpose.
week.
You did.
Goodbye.
No.